Can we start?
Am I audible? Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir.
Okay.
We can go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to welcome Mr. Arvind Datar for this lovely talk, which it'll be a lovely talk on rule of law, national and international perspectives. Because Vignesh said, give an introduction of Mr. Datar. I don't know whether it would be fair on my part to say I'll give an introduction because I'm very sure that will be very, very incomplete. But I should just like to point, many of the books that he's written, authored, all these things, all of you know about. But there are some two extraordinary things which he did for a few of us. One was once when I requested him to talk, and he said, look, I'll talk on Courtroom Genius. The 10-part video is available on YouTube, where he speaks on Mr. Palkhiwala, and the last about 10 minutes he spent on time management. I made a specific request that he should talk to us about his time management. I think that carries a lot of meaning for any of us, for every one of us. And if we even take one or two clues from it, we'll save a lot of time. There's never a subject on which he's not willing to talk, so long as it is somewhere connected with law. So when Srimati made this request that he must talk on this platform, Anand and myself went, and Vignesh was also there. We said, he gave us this topic of rule of law, national and international perspectives, all because, I somewhere tickled him on this. He had argued Kane matter, arbitration matter. So I decided, let me tickle, because there were a lot of principles I'm told was laid down in that, or at least reiterated there. So that's how this whole topic came together. I think I will not waste any further time. Welcome, Mr. Datar. It's now over to you.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Vignesh. When I was asked by Srimati to give this talk, it kept getting postponed because I was in the process of finishing my book on the Constitution. Unfortunately, I could not meet the deadline of 31st December, and I could not take any further adjournments as far as Srimati was concerned. So finally, I decided that I'll speak on this subject, and I thought we'll speak on 26th January, which is the Republic Day, which is also the day on which our Constitution came into force. And from being a colonial country, country ruled by a colonial power, we became a republic where we are governed by the rule of law. I particularly chose this topic of rule of law because ever since I read the book by Bingham on the rule of law, it has had some fascination for me, because like expression like due process or equality, liberty, these are all words which are very difficult to define, but we can understand what they mean. At the same time, the phrase is so important that we have to understand the contours, the concepts, the limitations of this particular provision. And when Ravi and Vignesh and Anand had come to my office just to say hello, we were having a chat, I had just perused the award which was passed by Kane, by the International Tribunal in the matter of Kane, where the Republic of India has been asked to pay damages of 1.2 billion pounds, above £1 billion. And what struck me was the main ground for holding the matter against the Republic of India was the retrospective amendment to the Income Tax Act, whereby the law was amended from 1962. And the tribunal has an elaborate discussion on the concepts of the rule of law, because under the international treaty, under the bilateral agreement with India and UK and most other countries which was there, India has revoked most of these bilateral agreements. There is a concept that each country will treat investors of the other country fairly and equitably. That's called the FET clause, fair and equitable treatment clause, popularly called the FET clause. And that's in Rule 3 of the bilateral treaty. Most treaties have the same rule, barring a few words here and there. And what was fascinating was that the tribunal had gone into the international perspectives of the rule of law. And they held that India violated the fair and equitable treatment clause because legal certainty is an important pillar of the rule of law. When a country invests in another country where there is a bilateral treaty, then it expects rule of law to prevail. And if any of the pillars of the rule of law are taken away, and taken away retrospectively particularly, then there's a violation of the FET clause. So it was amazing as to how this concept of rule of law, which we think is only part of administrative law or constitutional law, was then taken to interpretation of a treaty. And they said that the FET clause has embedded in it the concept of the rule of law. And that led me to go into further issues on what is the concept of the rule of law. And I was quite surprised to see the amount of literature on it. Now, before I start, I must thank my young colleagues, Saloni Diglia, Aditya Velapula, Rahul Unnikrishnan, for helping me prepare the background material and the rule of law, and on the subject of rule of law. They have done extensive research on the Australian concepts. There's an Oxford book on this particular subject and so on. So I've tried to summarize various perspectives. Now look at this picture carefully. Those of you who go to Venice, there is a similar picture. I don't know if this is exactly in Venice, but when I visited there almost 23 years ago, you will find that the lions at the bottom represents the king or represents the executive power. Just go back to the slide, please. And you'll find that the goddess of justice is above them. So the theory is that nobody is above the king except God and the rule of law. So that was the concept of law, that howsoever high you are, the law is above you. And that's a fundamental concept of the rule of law, that we are governed by law and not by men, by will. Next slide, please. Yeah, first slide. Now, in this particular, these points have been taken from the dissenting opinion of Justice Nariman in the review petition of the Sabrimala case. So those who are interested, it's in para 60 in his review judgment, which is reported in 2020, volume 2, SCC, page 1. And he refers to Aristotle, who says that it's better for the law to rule than one of its citizens. But before Aristotle, if you read the dissenting opinion of H.R. Khanna, he refers to Plato, and Plato's Republic surprisingly states that if the king is a philosopher, if philosophers are kings in any republic, then a rule by will is superior to rule of law. He says rule of law is a second choice. First thing should be rule by will, provided the kings are philosophers. Now, if our rulers are like Marcus Aurelius, who are very benevolent people who will not break the law, then we don't need it. But that doesn't happen. And therefore, we can't trust the rulers of any particular country, whether it's India, Europe, America, whatever it is. We require the rule of law to govern our country. So you'll find that as early as 2,500 years ago, Aristotle said that even the guardians of the law should obey the law. So nobody's above the law. The country or the republic or the state is governed by a set of rules and laws which are followed by everybody concerned. Then, of course, there is a Magna Carta. Those of you interested, I can send you an article by Lord Sumption, who says that the Magna Carta is highly overrated as a basis of human rights. And he has a very nice, interesting point to make, that Magna Carta is a much misunderstood and misinterpreted document. Then you have got the Petition of Rights signed by King Charles. More important than that was the Bill of Rights. And of course, you have John Locke's famous statement that whenever law ends, tyranny begins. Now, the US Constitution also 1789. But before I go to the US Constitution, I forgot to mention in this slide that a very, very important concept, a fundamental principle of the rule of law is the book by Montesquieu called The Spirit of Laws. In fact, all of us have studied that the separation of powers came from Montesquieu. He said that there should be executive, judiciary, and the legislature. And Montesquieu says that as long as these three wings of government perform their duties within their own limitations, democracy prevails, the rule of law prevails. The moment one branch tries to take over the other branch or interferes too much into the other branch, it is a collapse of the rule of law. So to the extent that there is a fusion between two branches, If tomorrow the judiciary starts taking more and more the role of the executive, or the executive overrides the judiciary, then to that extent democracy fails. Of course, in a totalitarian state like North America, there is no concept of separation of powers. Everything is just fused in one man, whether it's Hitler's Weimar Republic or the present North Korean government or other dictatorships where everything is concentrated in one power. There is no rule of law. So the important part of the rule of law is the separation of powers. And if you see the Federalist Papers of Hamilton, Jefferson, and other great architects, Benjamin Franklin, you will find that the US Constitution is substantially based on Montesquieu's concept of the separation of powers. And that's what they make it very clear. They say there's a judiciary, there's an executive, and there's Congress. And it was, of course, Marbury versus Madison, where he said that the courts have the power to say what the law really is. Next slide, please. Next slide, Vignesh. Yes. Now, the most important distinction of the rule of law is the book by Dicey. If you get a chance, it's now reprinted, Oxford book, and you will find that the rule of law starts with lecture 6. And I would advise young people, my young friends, to start reading this particular concept. And lecture 5, 6, 7 deal with the rule of law. And the fundamental of the rule of law is absence of arbitrary power. All men are subject to ordinary laws, and the predominance of the legal spirit, general rules of constitutional law. In fact, it's Dicey in lecture 8 who introduced the concept of constitutional morality. It is not what our Supreme Court is interpreting. Constitutional morality means respect for constitutional conventions, that you respect conventions, practices, and that is what is meant by the predominance of the legal spirit. Now, next point. Next. Yes. Dicey divides the rule of law into these concepts: the right to personal freedom, right to freedom of discussion. And it resonates with our constitution. If you see, the personal freedom are the freedoms contained in Article 19, the right to free speech, right to move into the country, right to practice your religion, right to public meeting is your right to association, and so on. These are the important features of the rule of law. And the last is the responsibility of ministers. In the UK, of course, there is no constitution, but it goes by convention. In our country, we have got a written constitution. And one point I'll mention here on the rule of law is our constitution is very, very elaborate. If you see, today's Republic Day, the day of our constitution came into force. And there was a huge debate that whether a constitution should be so long, like a tax statute or some other company law statute, or should it be just contain essential principles and leave it to the people to interpret it, leave it to the courts to interpret it. In fact, Pandit Nehru criticized the lengthy constitution, saying that it is like a huge forest, whereas it should have been a small avenue of trees. That's the expression used. But there is an outstanding speech by Dr. Ambedkar who explains why he has had an elaborate constitution. And he says that India is a young country. Most of the people, 42% of our population, were from princely states who were to merge into the constitution, into India. They had no knowledge of democracy. There is no constitutional convention of rights, duties, and the rule of law, ruled by a colonial power. And therefore, he says if rule of law is to prevail, if constitutional morality is not there in India, in the sense there are no constitutional conventions, it is better that we have a very elaborate constitution where we lay down what can be done by the ministers, by the governor, by the president, and so on. Therefore, you'll find in our constitution, the unique feature is everything is laid down as to what the governor has to do, what the president can do, what are his powers of pardon, what are the limitations on his powers. Everything is set out. So the constitution basically gives a framework for our country to function under the rule of law. Now, perhaps the best small book on the rule of law is this book by, next slide, please. One second. I think no, I think you have skipped a slide. Just go to the slide number 4. Yes. Just go to slide number 5. Yes. No, there is slide number 4. Sorry, called Rule of Law by Tom Bingham. I don't think it's in your slide. All right, doesn't matter. We'll just see if it's there. The no, there's one slide by Thomas Bingham where the important part of the rule of law of Lord Bingham is, of course, that the country should be rule of law. But the point which is interesting in the context of the Kane Award is that the law should be made in for the future. He says the essential part of the rule of law is you should not have retrospective legislation. He doesn't say retrospective legislation, but he says law should be made for the future and they should take effect in future, should not affect past transactions. And all laws should be publicly administered in the courts. Then we go to the next slide. Yes, dimensions of the rule of law. This is an outstanding collection of a lovely chapter by this professor Napolitano. And there is an Oxford book of comparative administrative law where there's a complete chapter on the rule of law, which I found to be fascinating. And he has discussed various aspects of rule of law. In fact, that itself can be the subject of a full lecture, but I try to summarize it in. So he compares, since the book Comparative Law, he compares Germany, France, Germany, France, England, US, Australia, and then he summarizes what are the dimensions of the rule of law. He uses the word dimensions. Let's say facets of the rule of law. First is authorization and guidance. That is the method of restricting a citizen's liberty or an individual's liberty must be in accordance with a prescribed statutory procedure. That is, it must be authorized to do so by a higher legal source. As they say, that howsoever high you may be, your liberty can be taken away only by an authorization of law. That is reflected in our Article 21, Article 22, where your liberty can be taken away only by a procedure prescribed by law. The second point is very important. See, each and every point has to be thought about carefully and deliberated upon. Predictability. Again, predictability is used by the tribunal in the concept of legal certainty. That is, the law should be predictable. There should be no rude surprises where suddenly the law completely changes arbitrarily at the whim and caprice of the legislature or the executive. Coherence, justification. Coherence talks of harmony of the laws, how the law should be coherent towards the basic law or the constitutional law. There's a lot of discussion on Germany's basic law, where all the laws must have a coherence with the basic law. Substantive and procedural fairness. Of course, this again in due process, you've got substantive due process, procedural due process. So fairness is not just in a procedure. Fairness is also by means of a substantive part of the law. It has to be also fair. Of course, procedure must be fair. And this is very, very important, independence and effectiveness of judicial review. In fact, the entire series on rule of law, the underlying point is an independent and effective judicial system is the most important foundation of the rule of law. Next, please. Next slide. Next slide, please, Vignesh. Next slide, please.
I think there is an interruption of internet on one of my devices, sir. Just give me 1 minute.
Yeah, okay. Take your time. Yeah. Thanks, Vignesh. Now, yeah, since I talked about international perspective, I did some reading with my colleagues on what are the principles of the rule of law in different constitutions, different democracies. And in Germany, of course, they've got the basic law. There is a constitution which is called the basic law, which can't be changed. There are principles like right to speech, liberty, democracy, etc. These are what we can call their basic structure, which can't be altered. Now, they say that the essential feature of rule of law is that Rex Stat, which means it's a state governed by rights. What it means is that it is used in contradiction to the next phrase. In contrast, if you don't have a state right, you got a police stat, which was what Nazi Germany was. It was a police state ruled by the Nazis, and though they had a constitution, which was of course not worth the paper. Now, the point is, and this is referred to as a principle of the state. The Rechtsstaat is that is an implicit concept in the entire Federal Republic, that Germany will be a country where rights are preserved, and it is a country governed by the rule of law. And the provision implies that the federal state itself is governed by the principle of rule of law. You go to France, they call it the État de droit, which means droit means the state of rights. Actually, I'm told that in French, droit is right and something else is left. So, but here the word right is used in the concept of legal rights, and there they call it the state of rights, which is the same as Rechtsstaat in Germany. Now, in France, whatever we saw, there is no reference to rule of law as such, but in fact, which is ironical, that was a country which gave us Montesquieu and the concept of separation of powers in 1748. And though there is no reference to rule of law, if you see the next sentence, Article 16 of their 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man, it says that a society in which observance of the law is not assured, nor the separation of powers defined, has no constitution at all. It's the French translation. So what it says is that if you don't have separation of powers and there is no observation of the rule of law, then it's no constitution. In fact, the more I think and more I ponder over this, I find that at the heart of it is the manner in which we maintain the separation of powers to the extent possible. We don't allow the executive to encroach upon the judiciary, or we don't allow the executive to take over parliament's powers. If parliament doesn't function properly, if they don't refer it to parliamentary committees, then the laws are virtually made by the executive. And again, that is also not a healthy sign at all. So you may have a constitution in name, but in reality, it's a weakened constitution. So to the extent there's a dilution of separation of powers, the constitution stands de facto weakened, if not de jure. Next. Now, Australia. Australia, again, you'll find the in their constitution, the preamble, they say absence of arbitrary power and universal subjection to the law remain at the center of the rule of law. Now, again, they are, if you see the three rules, there is a system of general rules which can be identified the rights, duties, powers, and immunities, which the legal system recognizes, rights and duties bearing entities. So you'll find that there are general rules, and there's an emphasis on what are the rights, what are the duties, and the powers and immunities. You'll find here, when you refer to rights, duties, powers, and immunities, you can see the shadow of Hofeld, or the ghost of Hofeld there, who has introduced the concepts of what are rights. Rights correspond to the duty, powers, and immunities. So this is a concept, a Hofeldian concept, which is now made part of the Australian Constitution. This is another good book, Kenneth Hayne, which talks of, it's a handbook on Australian constitutional law, and it's very well prepared. It's also available in India. Now, the third part is important. Disputes about the content application of rule must be determined fairly. Again, it talks of a judicial due process where if there is a dispute, then the manner in which you resolve the dispute must be fair, in the sense that there should be an independent judiciary and so on. These are all givens. Now, these are all constitutions which are much smaller constitutions compared to our constitution. Go to the next part. Now, I come to the Indian perspective. I've so far dealt with briefly Germany, France, Australia, UK, of course, we know. The US Constitution, we know. So I thought I'll focus on Germany and UK, France, which we don't normally come across. Now, in India, there are a number of judgments where the rule of law has been used. And particularly in the late 60s, if you see the earlier judgments of A.K. Gopal, etc., there's not much reference to the rule of law, etc. But this is what has been said. Now, in Chief Settlement Commission versus Om Prakash, it says that the concept of rule of law means the authority of law courts to test all administrative action by the standard of legality, rule of law rejects the conception of the dual state in which governmental action is placed in the privileged position from immunity of control of law. So, if you have basically what this says in simple terms is the independence of judiciary and independent judicial review is at the heart of the concept of rule of law. You can't have a situation where a particular law is completely immune. Of course, this is in 1969. In 1973, you had the Kesavan Bharati case, where they said that no law is immune from the basic structure. And now, after in the recent times, even an ordinary law has to satisfy the basic structure test. Now, E.P. Royappa, the term, just Bhagwati judgment, where a lot of portions have been taken from Vivian Bose also, where he says that rule of law is the undisputed supremacy of law and envisages a state of things in which everyone respects the law and where the law has to be followed. Now, one thing, these are all very good rhetorical statements or good statements. They look nice, they sound nice. What is important is how is it translated in day-to-day life? The point is, if a person is arrested, does he get bail immediately? If a person is incarcerated, is he subject to a fair and speedy trial? These are the essential features. So this particular thing is a good theoretical concept. What is important is how far this rule of law is translated. And a country will be governed by rule of law if it is not only a theoretical part, but in practice, you have the rule of law. So in that sense, we have some way to go. But fortunately, at least there is a rule of law prevails. The implementation may take time, but let's not forget that many countries don't even have the concept of rule of law. To that extent, we are much more fortunate that we are governed by a country where there is a rule of law. There's still judicial review. There are still, despite the hiccups and despite the aberrations, there is still rule of law. In KT Plantation, again, they say rule of law is an implied limitation on the authority of any limitation. So what it means is no branch is absolute. The constitution is supreme, whether it's the executive, it's the judiciary or the legislature. No one institution is superior. Everybody has implied limitations on this thing. And of course, in Vodafone, this was again quoted by the tribunal in the Kane case, International Tribunal. They say that certainty is integral to the rule of law. Vodafone was not concerned with the retrospective amendment. What Vodafone said was that you are now trying to tax indirect transfers, which had never been taxed in the past. So if there has been a consistent practice followed, that introduces a concept of legal certainty. So if you suddenly want to depart from it, you'll be violating the principle of the rule of law. So certainty and stability form the basic foundation of any fiscal system. And what happens is the absence of certainty and stability makes the fiscal system very, very unpredictable and leads to extensive litigation. It also detracts from the country's image as a country where rule of law prevails. In fact, I may tell you that in many European countries, there is a constitutional bar on retrospective legislation. Yes, Nalsa's case is, of course, important on transgenders and the other things. And again, they explain what is rule of law, is social justice. Of course, now like constitutional morality and so on, you keep on interpreting rule of law in different ways. You now say it's part of social justice, it's part of public order and so on. And after this slide, I'll come to the 7 principles which are the governing the rule of law. Then Roger Matthews, a tribunal case, where they said that the rule of law is the golden thread which runs through our constitution. And this binds all the chapter. I thought that's a nice passage. The rule of law is the golden thread which runs through our constitution. So whether it's fundamental rights, it's directive principles, it's the courts, the tribunals, etc. What is important is the rule of law. And ultimately you come to what do you mean by rule of law? What are the concepts of the rule of law? Before I come to the final, may I request? Yeah, just go to the next slide. To my mind, perhaps the most moving and fascinating and brilliant discussion on the concept of rule of law of all the things I've read, whether it's from US, Australia, France, etc., is the dissenting judgment of Justice H.R. Khanna in the famous ADM Jabalpur case. And it's in 76 Supreme Court, 1207. And in some other lecture also, I've urged particularly my younger friends that today, if you have the time, or at least you should make the time, to just read the dissenting judgment of H.R. Khanna. If you're running short of time, start with para 149, where it starts with the discussion of what is the rule of law. It's interesting it's interesting to put ourselves back in 1975 at the height of the emergency. As all of you know, Article 352 is the declaration of the emergency. And Article 359, there is a presidential proclamation after the emergency that all the rights are suspended. Now, I was surprised to know that there was an emergency even before the actual emergency. And fundamental rights, the right in the context of MISA, a presidential order had indeed been issued by the president on 16 November 1974. Now, those of us, I still remember emergency being declared. I was in Bombay at that time, and we were suddenly shocked to see emergency being declared. The Indian Express came with an editorial which was completely blank, showing that all fundamental rights are gone. Times of India had a black page, and so on and so forth. It was a sensational period at that point of time. Many young friends may not have been born or were young, very young at that point of time. So on November 74, there was an emergency. And in June 25th, 1975, as all of you know, there was a national emergency. And in 27 June, fundamental rights of 14, 21, and 22 were suspended. Then there was a 39th amendment, which put MISA in the 9th schedule. So you could not even challenge that maintenance of Security Act. Now, let's not forget that ADM Jabalpur is in the context of preventive detention. Now, once your rights under 14, 21, and 22 are gone, how do you question your detention? Now, it is fascinating that despite the declaration of emergency, 9 high courts held that although your fundamental rights may be suspended, but if your detention is contrary to the Maintenance of Security Act, if your detention is contrary to a statutory provision, that has not been suspended. So the right to invoke Article 226 cannot be taken away. Only you can't say that my detention is contrary to 14, 21, 22. That's all. But you can always say that my detention is contrary to other things, because Article 226 says it's not only for fundamental rights, but for any other purpose. So 9 high courts said so. All these judgments came to the Supreme Court. Of course, it is unfortunate that the majority held that there is no liberty, there is no freedom you cannot achieve. But it is H.R. Khanna who says that your fundamental rights may be suspended. But he makes the important point that your right to life and liberty doesn't come from Article 21. He says your right to life and liberty is inherent in every human being. Article 21 doesn't give you the right. It only protects that right. And even in an emergency, he says, the rule of law, he keeps on using the word rule of law in about 35 paragraphs. He says the rule of law says that your life and liberty cannot be taken away. Even if Article 21 is suspended, you have the right to approach the high courts for enforcing your rights. It's a fascinating discussion. He starts with the Magna Carta, goes to the US Constitution, the French provisions, etc., and then says that at the heart of it is the rule of law. In a democracy, if you say that there is no judicial review, there is no right to approach the courts, then you are saying that out of the 3 branches of law, the executive is completely supreme. The executive is answerable to nobody. Because you'll be shocked to note that there was a retrospective amendment to the Maintenance of Internal Security Act and said, once you're detained, they need not tell you the grounds of detention. They need not give reasons for rejecting your plea for being released. So virtually, you had no rights whatsoever. And the law said that retrospectively, that all detentions were validated and no reasons could be given. So he says that if you do that and say there's no judicial review, then the executive becomes supreme. Instead of becoming a separation of power, it becomes a kind of a dual state where there's only a legislature and the executive, and there is no judiciary worth the name as far as rights are concerned. So this is a fascinating topic. Fascinating judgment, which merits reading. I read it again last night, and could not help but being moved. Just imagine the emergency. Nobody has the rights. 4 judges say you have no rights, and this single man goes on to say that no, there is still a right. The high courts are right. And then in the last paragraph, he says that I hope that history will prove me right, and history did prove him right. Next paragraph. Next. Yes. Now, these are very interesting points also on the rule of law. Justice Chandrachud judgment is very good on the aspect of rule of law. He points out 3 essential features. I'm running out of time, so I will not get into this. Then, this is the dissenting judgment. I've taken 2 dissenting judgments, Puttaswamy and Bachchan Singh, where in the dissenting judgment, they emphasize on the rule of law. So, both H.R. Khanna, Puttaswamy, and Bachchan Singh, the rule of law was very nicely explained by the dissenting judges. Finally, I'll come to 2 slides, and there is a request that I speak on the Kane case. So I'll just come to that in 5 minutes. Yes, please come. Yes. Now, if you please follow the slide carefully. I did not know about this till I saw the award in the Kane case. The main question was, Kane made an investment in India from the 90s, late 90s, when oil exploration was open to international participation. So you had many international oil companies who had joint ventures with ONGC and so on and so forth for oil exploration. Kane, for some reason, went into corporate reorganization. They decided to sell part of it to Vedanta and so on. And in 2006, there was a reorganization where in the UK, shares of an English company in the UK, some shares were sold in the UK. Transactions took place overseas and were not subject to tax in India. To cut a long story short, at that time, the relevant law was, if a non-resident transfers an asset situated in India, then he is liable to pay Indian tax. But if the non-resident transfers an asset which is not in India, then it's not liable to Indian tax. Simple. So Kane had sold foreign shares in the UK, not liable to tax. Now, what they did was they retrospectively amended the law and said that even if it's a foreign share, but that foreign company has substantial assets in India, it will be deemed to be an Indian share. So retrospectively, you made a foreign share equivalent to an Indian share and you taxed it. In fact, there is another discussion on retrospective and retroactivity, which again, there is no time to discuss. This was a retroactive amendment. You not only made a person liable to tax from the past, you altered the factual situation. That is, if you simply say a tax of 10% will now be 20% with effect from 2010, it's a retrospective law. But if you alter the fact situation, in this case, you say a foreign share will be deemed to an Indian share, then it becomes a retroactive taxation. That's another interesting part. What is retrospective? What is retroactive? Unfortunately, no Supreme Court judgment has clarified this point very clearly. This is very well set out by an English scholar. And there's a lot of discussion in Israel and Canada on retrospectivity versus retroactivity. But when it came to the tribunal, they said that the retrospective amendment is violating the fair and equitable treatment. The sale took place in 2006, 2007. At that time, it was not taxable as per the law prevailing. In 2014, you assess them and make them liable to pay almost $1 billion in taxes by means of a retrospective amendment. And then they refer that this violates the fair and equitable treatment because Britain is entitled to expect in India fair and equitable treatment, and India can expect in Britain fair and equitable treatment. What are the principles of fair and equitable treatment or rule of law? And if you see this topic, the points, supremacy of law is 1, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of law, separation of powers, decision making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. Now, mind you, this is a report of the United Nations, and I think it very aptly summarizes the essential parts of the rule of law. I think this is perhaps the best account which sums up, if a country claims to be governed by the rule of law, then it must have all these elements. And just go to the next one, and I have concluded. Yes. The tribunal also quoted, I never knew there's something called the Venice Commission, which had gone into the essential features of the rule of law. And they said these are the 5 principles: legality, legal certainty, prevention of abuse or misuse of powers, equality before the law and non-discrimination, access to justice. So you will find that these are the principles. And why the case was held against India was on the ground of violation of legal certainty. There is no doubt that we have access to justice. Article 14 did not come in. There was no, because every non-resident was subject to that. Prevention of abuse or misuse of powers. They went primarily by the concept of legal certainty. They say that when a person makes an investment, he has to be taxed on the day on which that taxable event takes place. Today, if I'm a lawyer in 2020 and I'm not liable to service tax, you can't in 2030 retrospectively change the law and say all lawyers shall be deemed to be liable to service tax from 2020 onwards. That is violating the principle of legal certainty. Now, I'll just I'll just conclude with the last. I just thought I liked this poem very much. I remember reading it when I was in law college. A land of settled government, a land of just and old renown, where freedom slowly broadens down from precedent to precedent. Yes. Thanks. Thank you very much. Now, if there are any questions, I'll answer them. I think somebody wanted to know about the Kane case. Yeah. So I thought I'll speak for about 35 minutes, highlighting the principles of the rule of law. So if any questions are there, I'll be happy to take them.
I think Mr. Srinath Sridevan has raised his hand for a question. I'll just unmute him for a moment.
Yeah. Would they like to ask me the question, or should I read it and all the admin?
Sir, I think I'll just repeat the question. So we often find we are arguing positions which are popular in the context of the current social trends. Unpopular, I'm sorry. So how do you argue for rule of law when you're arguing an unpopular position and the courts are also aligned with the so-called popular position?
Well, the fundamental part of the rule of law is there is no majority provision or a minority position. There is a rule of law position. So even if you're arguing, for example, now the other day I did a transfer matter against fortunately we succeeded, where they wanted to transfer all the love jihad cases to the Supreme Court. Now in Uttar Pradesh, the majority government thinks it fit to introduce something called a love jihad law, where in technical terms, that if you get married, either interfaith marriage, there are allegations of conversion and so on and so forth. Now, the Allahabad High Court is seized of the matter, and I think that though it may be a majoritarian position, people are able to argue against it. So I don't see that. Of course, there could be some cases where you feel that the courts are not following the rule of law in the sense that they are reluctant to challenge the majoritarian position. But there are equally cases where the courts have struck down laws, though they are favoring the majority. Yes. So like, for example, mining law, many cases have been held against the mine owners in favor of the environment, though there could be an argument where it went to a particular extreme and there was too much of a knee-jerk reaction. But I have a feeling that one may feel that in some cases the Supreme Court or the High Courts have not what they call the expectation gap was there. But I think the rule of law still prevails as far as India is concerned.
Thank you, sir.
And I can also say that in many cases, the High Courts have more than lived up to the occasion and come to the rescue of people. Yes. Anybody else?
I think Mr. NL Raja has put his hands up.
Yeah. So it's also a case on Kane. I'll answer that last on the Kane case. Yeah. Raja wants to say something.
Yeah. Thank you, Arvind, for that very interesting presentation. See, inherent in this concept of rule of law would also be the question as to who makes the law. So, therefore, we subject ourselves to a system where the legislature makes the law, the courts apply the law, and the government has to act in line with the law. Now, if this were to be in any way distorted, subject to reasonable exceptions, as all rules are always subject to reasonable exceptions, it is acceptable. But when when the legislature has passed a law, and there are a majority of people who say that that law is reasonable, and then a court which consists of two gentlemen or three gentlemen say that it is unreasonable. So you are pitting the concept of reasonableness of a majority of the members of the legislature against just two or three minds which say that it is unreasonable. So the problem about that is that I can't even retrospectively change the law because I have this problem, because the court has said it is unconstitutional. So in these situations, do you not think that there should, as we evolve, as the constitutional law in the country evolves, we need to have some sort of a standard by which courts can sort of say what is reasonable, what is unreasonable? And do you think that, in your opinion, do you think that the court has always been correct in holding certain laws to be reasonable and certain laws to be unreasonable?
Yes, I'll answer your question with two examples. You take the National Judicial Appointments Commission, the NJC Act, which I had also appeared. Now, that was passed unanimously. The only person who dissented was Ram Jethmalani. So everybody in the Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, it was unanimously approved. This, not even just 2/3 majority, everybody approved it. But it was struck down. Now, there are comments which say they went too far. But if you see the way the amendment was made, if you see the National Judicial Appointments Commission, the point is, even if the entire parliament makes a law which is contrary to the basic structure, it will be struck down. Now, you can't say that these 5 people have said so and therefore it is bad. That's the way the constitution works. You can make a law, if it is unanimous, it will be struck down. Similarly, for example, in Companies Act, even if all the shareholders pass a resolution unanimously, there is a law which says that notwithstanding operation mismanagement where 10% have to oppose, if the resolution is against the provision of law, a single shareholder can stand up and get it nullified. So there the rule of law prevails, and it is left under the constitution for a bench of 2 judges or 5 judges or 7 or 10 or 11 to decide what the right is. Yet it is struck down. Now this is the question of NJAC. Now take the other matter where we lost and it's now pending in the Supreme Court, the Maratha reservation case. Unanimously, the Maharashtra government passed a law saying that there will be separate exclusive registration for Marathas, 16% over and above the 50% limit. Now, Indira Sawhney says that you can't cross the 50% limit. Now, to answer your question, if this is a constitutional limitation, then even if all the people get together, they can't cross it unless they amend the constitution and says 50% is not the limit. You can have 95% reservation. Then that's the new norm. Then that you're tested against that particular position. So now, can you say that these 2 judges of the Bombay High Court who upheld the law, suppose they had struck it down? In fact, the earlier Mr. Mohit Shah was there. He had passed interim order staying it, saying that you have no power to cross the 50% limit, and he granted interim stay of the act. So I think that's part and parcel of the rule of law, where there's legal certainty. 50% is the limit. You can't do this. You see, for example, promotion also, certain limitations are there. So I think that is part and parcel of the rule of law.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, but I think earlier the British used to have a system where before a law was placed in the legislature, it was sent to the judiciary for its opinion. Very interestingly, our High Court library still receives bills before they are placed in the assembly as a part of an old tradition, even though they have no value at all. They still receive bills from the assembly, and nobody knows what to do with it. But they had a system where they would consult the judges before they passed the law. So I think they were a little more cautious than the present.
I know, Raja. I read one of the articles. There used to be some old article where one article I read was they would send it to the Bar Association also for their comments. The legislative thing would send it to the Bar Association. And of course, these practice continue in a lighter vein. I was reading a particular comment. England was expecting Napoleon to invade England. The French army was expected to invade England. And on the cliffs of Dover, they had kept a man with a big bell, and he was expected to ring the bell if he saw the Napoleon navy approaching England. And there was a person who was one of the town sheriff or the town person who was to get an extra salary to sound the bell if Napoleon came. Then they found when they inspected the audit, that salary was being paid, extra salary was being paid till 1931. Then they said that there is no chance of Napoleon invading England and that salary was abolished. So like your bill still coming to the High Court, this practice just continues year after year because of the bureaucracy. Yes.
Yes, sir. Arun, sir, Arun Giri here. So can I just slip in a quick question, sir, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
Arun,
Yeah,
thanks, sir. It's a wonderful lecture at the outset, and it's been an exposition. I'll remember this. Sir, my question is very brief. You had President Trump who tried to overthrow the election results. He filed some 36 petitions in various courts, his team. They came up short in every state court, every state Supreme Court, the Federal Appeals Court, and finally the Supreme Court. And even justices appointed by him did not come to rescue him, sir. Any lessons from this entire episode where the president of the free world, I would say, tried to overturn the election results, but came up short every time he approached the courts? Any lessons for us?
See, this itself shows the rule of law and shows how important robust institutions are to a democracy. And this is not just for Trump. You have cases where earlier some presidents have appointed judges who were expected to have a toe the government line. They have gone against the government. Why go to US? What happened to Boris Johnson? In the initial Brexit time, it was unheard of for English Parliament to say that what he did was wrong in that in the second case in the UK Supreme Court. They said that you can't prorogue Parliament and ignore the parliamentary check and make the executive pass the order in terms of it. The UK Supreme Court struck it down. This is the robust thing of the rule of law. Take our own high courts. If you read ADM Jabalpur, 9 high courts set people at liberty. They said emergency or no emergency, if you violate MISA, your man has to be free. So these are all very happy examples of a robust institution. And you see, ultimately, this all is a concept of limited government. Neither the legislature is absolute, and ultimately the judiciary is there to make checks and balances. And telling Raja about making laws, one disturbing feature which I have challenged and is now pending. In GST, there is a provision where the executive can pass retrospective notifications. Now, my point is, I don't know what will happen ultimately, that making law is an essential legislative function. You may delegate it for sake of convenience, but you can't tell the executive that you can change the rate of tax, you can change anything under the GST law retrospectively, the executive, by means of a notification. And all this thing of tabling in Parliament is meaningless. Even in the UK, there was an article by Mark Elliott. Only 0.2% of the notifications are ever read by British parliamentarians. I think the same figure will be in India. You just table it for the sake of saying. So whether the notifications in the excess of delegated power can be made retrospectively is a very, very worrying thing, which is now pending in the Delhi High Court.
Thanks, sir.
I think Mr. Raja was about to conclude on something.
No,
Mr. Raja,
I was only pointing out that there was this very similar, Arvind had pointed out this Napoleon conquest incident. There is interestingly a very similar incident in India. Churchill during Second World War used to get great satisfaction from smoking Warayur cigars from Tripoli. So there were 2 cartons of Warayur cigars which used to be sent to Churchill every year, and it was used to be sent to the Secretary of State in England. Now, World War was gone, Churchill was gone till 1972. Faithfully, we were sending 2 cartons of Warayur cigars to England. Till T.N. Session, who was then in the office of the Home Ministry, asked, why are we doing this? Then they realized that, so I refer to this in quotes, when the GEVO has lost its purpose, I refer to it as the Warayur cigars, the GEVO, because it lost its purpose a long time back.
Yeah. No, there's one thing. Does anybody who still want to hear on the cane matter, because we're running out of time? So there's a message on the cane.
There is a question from Sudarshan.
Yeah, please.
Sir, I have 2 questions. Second one is incidentally on the cane related. My first question is on outside Happy Republic Day to you as well and to all these. So my first question is on the growing alternative dispute resolution, which I see this huge amount of conversation happening on the mediation aspect. Now with private sector mediation, do you think they present a challenge to courts and more especially rule of law? I would like to quote the renowned legal scholar Hazel Ken here, where she said, ADR services are basically failure of the courts, and moreover, they can be as a means of sidestepping the legal system in which public have no confidence. So what is your view on that? And my second question on the cane, so where you can segue to the cane as well. You rightly mentioned about retrospectivity. My concern on the rule of law vis-a-vis the bilateral investment issues are, you also indicated various countries have their own rule of law definitions. So therefore, in India, even though technically retrospective is possible, of course not on a levy, and there are bilateral investment agreements where there are specific tax stabilization clauses, which means that when at the time of an investor comes in and the country agrees for a stabilization and say, no, I'm not going to go back and change, and the fact that tax is a sovereign, I somehow see the rule of law. Can there be a harmonious rule of law, international definition given to a rule of law, and also the fact that shouldn't you have to look from a country perspective? And when there are also treaties which talks about tax stabilization clauses, I feel the rule of law seems to be applied in a very, very superficial manner. These are my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I would beg to differ that mediation is one of a manifestation of the failure of the legal system, not necessarily so. Maybe Lok Adalats are. Maybe Lok Adalats are there because just the sheer amount of litigation is so much. You see, these are all matters of necessity. Now, if you got people who have lost kith and kin in accidents and they're going to wait 3-4 years for their compensation. We don't have adequate judges. We don't have adequate structure. You accept this is a reality. You're not living in utopia. And you tell the person, like, nobody compels you to go to a Lok Adalat, but there is a Lok Adalat and say that, see, Mr. Rangan, you had an accident, you lost your leg or whatever, and you may get 1 lakh after in 2026 or something like that. And now it's your call. You say, okay, instead of waiting for me, the uncertainty, I'll rather take 50,000 rupees now, put an end to litigation, and I require the money right now. That may be a failure of the legal system, but that's an option open to you. But there's an all over the world. You got, say, in the US, you got plea bargaining systems. You got people who have violated the law, but they agree to pay a fine and they settle it because they don't want the uncertainty. You got settlement commission for income tax also. All these are methods to avoid litigation. I don't think it's because every trial can't go to the end with first appeal, second appeal, and so on. That's why I don't think. Secondly, mediation, I think it's a wrong understanding because if you ask me frankly, as I've been the joint secretary, done a lot of mediations, I learned a lot from Sriram Panchu and other people. But I personally feel in family matters, family disputes, shareholder disputes, mediation is a better way to resolve the dispute rather than litigation. Because, and one thing in mediation, it has got so many plus points. I may just have a dispute. Suppose we are brothers and we have a dispute. We not only solve a shareholder problem, but we may have other disputes, other cousins, brothers, all can come together and solve a problem. So mediation has got a lot of interesting features. So we should really encourage mediation is my view. Now coming to cane, see, one thing I must tell you that people keep on telling me, how can you, taxing is my sovereign power and so on. So nobody disputes that. But why did you enter into a treaty? Why do you enter into a treaty with so many people after 91? Because we found a lot of foreigners coming in, wanting to come in, and they want a protection that if their investments are threatened, they're investing $1 billion, $2 billion. Suppose tomorrow there's a threat, what happens? So every treaty provides for anti-expropriation, that the assets of the foreigner will not be taken away. There'll be no unfair equitable treatment. And mind you, it's a bilateral treaty. Just imagine the situation. Suppose Tata's had invested in the UK in 2005, and they've done some transactions which are exempt from UK tax laws. Now, will it be fair to tax Tatas in 2014 by retrospectively change the UK law? UK could not have done it. So if you read the award, at the heart of it is retrospective law. In fact, since you asked the question, there is a leading case of Paushok versus Mongolia. A lot of Russian investors put money into Mongolia because there's a lot of mineral oil, gold, etc. And Mongolia, gold prices shot up. I mean, from X, they became 10X. And these companies made massive windfall profits. So Mongolia imposed a very heavy tax. They increased their tax substantially. This was challenged before the International Arbitration Tribunal. There, the Arbitral Tribunal says that you have no guarantee that tax will remain low. If a country increases taxation, it's perfectly entitled to do so. There is no legitimate expectation that tax will be low. But that Mongolia case says that suppose they do it retrospectively, then that is bad. So another thing I'll tell you, there's a very nice 1928 article, I think it's in Harvard Law Review, where they say that every treaty is a partial surrender of sovereignty. when I enter into a treaty with UK or a double taxation treaty, I say, though I've got the right to do so, I will not do this. You have the right to do that. You will not do it. Both of us agree to compromise our rights for mutual investor benefit, mutual commercial benefit. What's an arbitration clause in a contract? I say I will not go to a normal court of law. I will go to an arbitration. We agree that we'll go to arbitration, which is expected to be faster. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Avinash has one question, sir. I think should be the last question for the day.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for educating us and taking time out of your busy schedule. My question, sir, light deviation from what you had stated. Do you honestly believe that originalism helps bolster the rule of law as opposed to the concept of a living constitution?
You see, this whole thing of originalism, Robert Bork and others and all that, I think it will be unfair to make it as a binary, originalism versus living constitution. I think let's take a mix of both. There are certain parts where originalism has to prevail. Like if you go to the preamble, liberty, equality, fraternity, etc. This you can't change it. That's there. That will live for centuries, long after you and me are no more. But what is the concept of equality? That will keep on changing. The principle of equality is there. It may have different facets. So when you talk of a living constitution, it continues. Take, for example, the article, section 377, the concept of same-sex union, same-sex marriages. It was thought to be a crime because they thought it's against the law of nature, against God, so to speak. Forget God, but at least against nature. It said it's unnatural. Now medical evidence shows it is not unnatural. So that's part of the living constitution. So a law which prohibits that, which is natural, will be contrary to law. And that's why that maxim, cessante ratione legis, cessante ipsa lex, when there's no reason, when the rationale for the law goes, the law also must go. So I think we should have a happy blend of originalism with a living constitution.
So, but where would you factor in the separation of powers vis-a-vis judicial activism? Because the line drawn in the sand seems to be washed away quite a bit by the Supreme Court. And there is no, if I may say so, that you can't concretely decide as to which way the Supreme Court is going to swing on something.
I agree with you that there are some cases where the court may have crossed the line, gone into legislation like banning diesel or banning liquor beyond 500 meters, or say, for example, say for example, what is the NEET exam? It's also a creature of the Supreme Court. Where do you get the concept of NEET exam? So here, but what happens is, unfortunately or fortunately, the decisions, some of them have been welcomed. Like, for example, the banning of pollution vehicles and entirely Justice Kripal's order at that time, Supreme Court's order. But it was welcomed by the judiciary, by the people. So I agree that the concept of PIL, judicial activism, may have overshot the limit sometimes, but it has got its place in India because our society is unique. We've got 28 states, we've got 1.4 billion people. It is not always possible for the completely for the legislative and executive to act. In fact, we owe a lot to the courts for environmental protection, which we can't wash away. I mean, it would have been a disaster. I mean, I know people like Mr. Salvas gave a lecture for the Palkhiwala Foundation and said, but for the Supreme Court, the extent of forest cover would have come to less than 10%. It's only because the complete Supreme Court banned forest cutting and took very harsh measures that this was stopped. So judicial activism has got its place. And I think it has got a role to play. I would not completely say that the court should not get into it at all, especially in environment matters. Some matters where there's a sort of a legislative vacuum or an executive vacuum, it can be. But it should be it should not become an unruly horse in that sense.
Thank you very much, sir. So Vignesh, can we wrap up with that? I believe so.
Yeah, there are a couple of more questions, sir. The choice is if you want to take those questions or wrap it up.
Yeah, I can for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, we can go on.
Or you can probably brief us on the Kane case and wrap it up. I think the choice is yours.
No, what if you ask the question, what do you want to know about the Kane case?
So before that, just one question on what you told Avinash, sir. From what you're saying, I think you're agreeing with Justice Holmes' theory that law is a prediction of what the courts may do in a given case. Is that the rule of law, sir? Is it a prediction of, because it's a living constitution you're saying? So do you agree with that statement, sir?
Yes. You have to be very careful on what we are saying. Now, predictability is important. Legal certainty is important. But there are particular cases where the courts will have to take a new view. There's always a turning point. You can't have the status quo. See, predictability means the status quo continues forever and forever. But there could be a situation where, like what Holmes, since you quote Holmes, there's a lovely dissenting judgment where Holmes talks of the hydraulic pressure of public opinion or the hydraulic pressure of society. So that hydraulic pressure may require a change. Take Vishaka's case. There was nothing on sexual harassment in the workplace, but there was no law at all. But the Supreme Court stepped in and said, yeah, these are the guidelines. Still, Parliament makes the law, and ultimately all the states made law. So though there is predictability, but suppose we find that the times are changing. Now, today, the technology is driven. We've got artificial intelligence. We've got privacy issues and so on. It is time to change. For example, if you say predictability, then privacy could never have become part of part 3. But because times have changed and we find, yes, privacy is as important as the other fundamental rights, we have made a shift. So this is what is the beauty of common law. It evolves in stages according to the needs, what again Holmes calls the felt necessities of the times. So according to the felt necessities, the law keeps on evolving. The contours of the fundamental principle rule of law are getting molded to meet the needs of society.
Sir, Atman has a question. Atman, can you unmute yourself?
So good afternoon, sir. First of all, it's been a pleasure to hear you speak. I just have a very elementary doubt with what you took up previously regarding the Love Jihad ordinance. I wanted to ask you that you mentioned the fact that the rule of law somehow has the ability to trump conflicts and contrariness with the law. I want to ask you, when an ordinance such as this exists, where there are clear and explicit contradictions with certain notions of personal liberty and certain notions of self-determination, and when the court refuses to look at such things and fails to acknowledge these conflicts with self-determination and personal liberty, what do you think the rule of law plays in this kind of situation? What do you think the role of rule of law is in situations like this?
Well, first of all, I must tell you that it's not that the court has turned a Nelson's eye and refused to look into it. The point is, the Allahabad High Court has moved with very rapid speed. The ordinance came in a few months in the last year, and it was actually posted for final hearing on the 17th or 18th of January. It got adjourned to 25th on the ground that the matter is transfer petition has been filed. From 25th, it's been adjourned to 4th of February or 2nd of February for hearing. So within a matter of 3 months, the challenge is coming up for final hearing before the Chief Justice. So that, I think, is a manifestation of the rule of law, that if you pass a law on the so-called Love Jihad law, that will be challenged. Tomorrow you may have something on ban on cow slaughter. You may have, for example, the Sabrimala case. Now you could have strong opinions as to whether women can be excluded. But again, we leave it to the courts to decide what is the meaning of rule of law. Can a society governed by rule of law? Is there a place for a Love Jihad law? Is there a place for a Sabrimala kind of situation? And then the courts decide. So I don't think, in fact, I think this is a manifestation that rule of law still prevails in the country, that the Allahabad High Court has taken it on top priority. But for the Supreme Court transfer, which was rightly dismissed by the Chief Justice, it was the case would have started on 25th itself. Final arguments. I'm not just admission over, counter over, and the final arguments are starting.
Sir, last question for the day for everyone, please. Mr. V. Sankar, could you please unmute yourself and ask the question? Thank you.
Sir, good morning, sir. It was amazing presentation. I am fortunate to hear you a few times. As usual, it was spellbound. But my question may be very basic. Kindly pardon me. Now, our country is basically having so many diversities. The education level and the cultural diversity, population, all those things are there. Taking this into account, once after implementing or passing a law, it needs to be reviewed once in a certain period, whether that system is there in the country, and there will be so many limitations on the rule of law, whether that has been taken care in the system as on date. Thank you, sir.
There are some. Well, I agree that there should be a review of the laws from time to time, and I think it does happen. Laws are reviewed. There are changes being made. For example, after Nirbhaya, the entire IPC has been changed. Then recently, after the new electronic age, the Evidence Act has been altered. So I do think that there is a review taking place in the laws. Take, for example, after the entire issue of the social media and so on, the new personal data protection bill is before Parliament. They have called for comments from all the intermediaries like Google, WhatsApp, Facebook. Their comments are coming. So you'll have a new data protection law coming into India at the moment. So I think the laws are being reviewed. I don't think that the laws are static forever and ever. They are being reviewed. But if a law has stood the test of time, there is no need to change it for the sake of changing it, like a Contract Act. It has stood the test of time. It can continue. The Sale of Goods Act, 1930, almost 90 years are over. It's a good law. Why should we change it? Yeah.
So once again, sir, thank you very much. Sir. Time out of your busy schedule, and hopefully we will.
I can't hear you.
Sir, once again, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Okay.
And hopefully we will be able to trouble you again to educate us on a
No, sorry, your voice is snapping. I can't. I hope my audio was clear to all of you. I think Mr. Avinash your image is frozen. I'm not able to
trouble you again.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I lost there was a internet problem, but thanks for the good wishes, and thanks to everybody for staying on in the midst of on a Republic Day holiday to listen to a lecture on the rule of law. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir.
Vignesh, I couldn't speak on the cane because it will take more time. So
no, it was more a general hearing that we wanted to take from you. So we'll have one other occasion where we will again be pleased to host you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wish you all the best. Wish you all, everybody. Happy New Year to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So confused is the